Welcome. In this demo, I'll show you how to apply validation to invoice date in AP Unapproved Invoice. Let's apply validation to the invoice date in AP Unapproved Invoice. To demonstrate the issue, let's go ahead and enter a date that's far into the future. For example, I'll enter January 1st, 2029. As you can see, the system allows me to save it without any issue, even though the date is obviously wrong. This is not something we want, so we're going to apply a validation to prevent it from happening in the future. First, we'll navigate to the user validation table in Vista. Here, I'll enter the validation procedure code. If I mistakenly enter something else, the system will automatically add the USP prefix, so don't worry if you forget to include it. We'll start by specifying the name for our validation procedure, which we'll call USP AP Date. Now we need to tell the system which table this validation should apply to. In the description tab, we'll add inv date validation and click Save. Next, navigate to the Tables section, then go to the field and select Field Properties. Press F3 to bring up the Field Properties table. Take note of the table name, which in this case is AP UI, as we'll need it for our validation reference. Next, I'll define the error message that will be displayed if the invoice date exceeds the allowed limit. I'll name this error message Invoice Date Error to make it clear. Now, I need to set up a parameter for the invoice date. I'll add this parameter so that the system can validate the date against the criteria we set. First, in the Table section, press F4. You'll now see the table I entered, displayed under table name. Press Enter. At this point, you'll notice parameter and other columns. After specifying the table and parameter, I'll verify the correct column name, which in this case is INVDAT. If you're unsure about the column name, you can press F3 to display it. To start, I'll create a simple validation rule that checks if the invoice date is less than a specific value, say 1234, just as a placeholder. All the information we're entering under this table, whether it's the parameters, operators, values, or error messages, allows us to use the initialize procedure, which automatically generates the SQL query for us. Now, if I hit initialize, it generates my SQL code. Technically, I could manually write all of this, and it would still work, but this method is much quicker. Let's walk through what's happening. First, it's creating parameters, indicated by the @ sign. So, inv date is the parameter we're going to pass a value to. And the same goes for @message. Further down, it shows that whatever is entered into the invoice date field for the AP invoice will be passed through as a parameter. We can then apply the less than operator to compare it against whatever value we define. It says, if the value entered for the invoice date is less than the specified value, we proceed with no issue. In this case, the message will be null because the invoice date is within the allowed range. However, if the invoice date is greater than or equal to the specified value, it will trigger the error message, Invoice Date Error. So, if the logic doesn't apply, meaning the date entered exceeds the allowed limit, this error message will appear. Let's go back and adjust the logic by setting a proper validation for the invoice date. What we want is to ensure the invoice date is less than today's date. To achieve this, we'll use the SQL function, getDate function, and save it. Now when we return to SQL and initialize again, it will give us the getDate function. This means that if the invoice date entered is before today, everything will proceed smoothly. However, if the invoice date is today or in the future, an error will be triggered. But this approach might be a bit too aggressive because there are situations where we may need to enter future invoice dates, such as rent payments or other scheduled expenses. So let's modify the parameters and provide a buffer of 30 days to allow some flexibility. Next, we go back to SQL, hit initialize, and it will now apply the 30-day buffer. However, a small adjustment is needed. SQL will treat this as a value, but we need it to be recognized as a function. So we'll remove the quotation marks around the date, and that's all we need to do. Now, click Save. Now use the validation procedure we just created. We'll apply it to the field. Go back to the field, press F3, and access the System Overrides tab. In the validation box, we want to provide a warning, but still allow the invoice to be saved. This ensures that if someone does need to enter an invoice with a date more than 30 days in the future, it's possible, but they'll be clearly warned. Once this is set up, hit Compile to ensure everything compiles successfully. Now, return to the Invoice Date field. In the Procedure section, select the procedure we created, USP AP Invoice Date, and hit OK. Now we need to add the parameters. We've created a parameter called @InvoiceDate, which relates to the invoice date, but we haven't yet linked it to the actual field. So, scroll down, find the appropriate field, click the Map button, and link that parameter to the invoice date field. Once done, click OK. Now, hit Apply, then close and reload the AP Unapproved Invoice entry form. Click OK to reload the form. Now let's test it. If we enter a past date and save it, no problem will arise. If we enter a future date, the system will show an error. For instance, if today is February 3, 2019, and we enter February 15, 2019, the system will accept it without any issues due to the buffer. And that's it. You've successfully learned how to apply date validation to ensure that future dated invoices cannot be incorrectly entered in the AP Unapproved Invoice form. Thank you for watching. For further information, or to see some of the exciting solutions we're working on, use the link in the description or reach out to us using the contact details provided.